When I'm having a conversation about prepping with someone, something I always like to ask them is, what first got you into prepping? What was the event or the revelation or whatever else that happened that made you first start really thinking about not only how important it might be to be prepared, but also realize how unprepared you are at that time. The reasons and the events and the situations differ so widely from person to person, and it's something that's always interested me and helps me, I think, get an insight into not only my own mind frame on the topic, but understanding other people's mind frames kind of opens my mind about the whole thing in general. So in this video, I thought I would share a bit about what first got me into prepping. I can sort of trace back when I first started thinking about it to a specific event. In 2003, there was a catastrophic power grid failure in the northeastern United States and a pretty sizable hunk of Canada as well. There was some sort of software error. I can't remember the specifics of what the problem was, but some kind of computer error that set off a chain reaction that shut down the power grid in 7 states and I believe most of Ontario. In total, 45 million people in the US were affected, and I think 10 million in Canada. So power was completely down for 55 million people for between 2 and 14 days, depending on where you were at. The grid sort of came back in different waves. Now, I remember the day that it happened. I was working at a friend's house, helping him remove some wallpaper in his house, and I was using a pump sprayer and spraying some of that wallpaper remover liquid all over the walls. And I thought maybe I sprayed a little bit too close to one of the plug outlets because suddenly everything in the house died. So try as I might, I couldn't find anything wrong with the circuit breaker panel or anything like that. And then I started noticing neighbors around there start coming out of their house and talk to each other. And so I went and started talking to one of them, and he said that the radio is claiming there was a massive power outage that affected a huge portion of the country. So I called it a day on helping with the wallpaper and started heading home. I lived about, let's say, what would ordinarily be about a 15-minute drive to home, and it took hours. There was obviously no stoplights working, and there was absolute gridlock just everywhere. I knew that I didn't really have much food at the house, especially non-perishable food. So on the way home, I stopped at a convenience store that seemed to be open, and they were, of course, only accepting cash because they had no power, which meant no credit card machines, nothing. So I used the little bit of cash that I had and bought some bags of chips and a couple of bottles of water. It wasn't much, but it's all I had, and it's all I could think to do. So finally I got home, and it was probably about 6 or 7 p.m. by this time. And I just remember thinking, I better start using all the food in the fridge because it's going to be bad very quickly. It was a very hot August day. The temperatures were in the high 80s, if I recall. I had a bunch of fresh meat and vegetables. So I remember firing up my grill and getting out a big wok and making some big vegetable pork stir fry, and I seem to remember it being pretty tasty too. But I guess that's possible when you're throwing every ingredient you have into a big skillet. What was interesting is that the first night, there was almost an atmosphere. There was almost a party-like atmosphere in the neighborhood. At the time, I lived in a city just north of Detroit, very very populated, not particularly nice neighborhood, but I think everyone had the same idea as me. Start barbecuing all your meat. Drink all the beer in the fridge before it gets hot. It was festive. It was almost a block party. And so that was kind of fun. But I really started to think about the fact that I had no other food in the house except those couple of bags of chips. The water pumping stations in the area weren't really working. If you turned on your tap, you would get just the slowest trickle. So I was able to fill up the bathtub by letting it just run forever, and filled up a couple of buckets so I could flush the toilet. But pretty much I had only the couple of bottles of water I bought and what little bit I could get out of the faucet. I realized there was very little food, a very limited supply of water. I had very little gas in my gas tank, probably an eighth of a tank, and at the time I drove a big van, so that's not gonna go very far. And I had almost no means to defend myself or the household. I believe at the time all I had as far as firearms was a Ruger 1022, 22 caliber rifle with something like 1.5 magazines of ammunition. So that's somewhere between 10 and 15 bullets, 22 caliber bullets. Not exactly a great setup for defending anything, except maybe if a half a dozen squirrels were trying to invade the house. I remember it being very, very hot that night, unable to sleep because of how hot it was. I remember wanting to go and sit in my van and run the air conditioner just to cool down, but I had such little gas that would have been pretty stupid, so I didn't do that. I spent most of the late evening and all night in my basement, which was just kind of a dirty, yucky basement, not really set up to sleep in, but I went down there and just brought a pillow and an air mattress and slept with the spiders that night. There was very limited cell phone service. I was able to get a call through to my dad and talk to him briefly, and they were in pretty much the same pickle as I was, as was everybody I knew. We figured, well, we're probably not going to be able to reliably communicate with each other, so I guess we'll talk when communications are back to normal. I woke up the next day and listened to the radio in the van for a while, and learned a little bit more about the problem, learned how far spread the thing was. Had myself a breakfast of chips, and pretty much just sat around for the day. I wasn't going to try to go anywhere. There were some people trying to head out of town to get gas. I believe that there was way on the outskirts of this area is where the outage ended. I should say the affected area ended maybe 40 miles or so from where I was, and there was people trying to head out there just to get gas and maybe stay with family if they still had power. Well, that wasn't an option for me. I don't think I could have made it anyway with the gas I had. Plus, I didn't know anybody out there. And if I could have gotten to a gas station, what are the odds that they would have even had any gas left? So I stayed put. I didn't do anything. I sat around and just sort of periodically listened to the radio in my car. Where I lived, the power came back on about, I'll say, 30 hours after it went out. So just over a full day. And that was I was on the very short end of it as far as when people were restored. There was a lot of the affected people didn't get their power back until between 1 and 2 weeks later. Now I've dealt with power outages here and there all my life, as anybody has, but usually it's your house or your neighborhood or a few neighborhoods. There's always somewhere you can go, somewhere you can get out of the heat or the cold, somewhere you can go and get some food, someone who has a fridge that you can put all your food in so it doesn't spoil. But it's a really different situation when everything, everywhere, everyone around you is in the same boat that you are. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. I thought pretty deeply about how screwed I could have been. Like I said, I was only out for a little over a full day. But if everybody was out for 2 weeks, like the least fortunate had to deal with, it would have gotten pretty ugly. In fact, in my area, not everybody was on at the same time as me, and there were reports by the second night of looting, violence, breaking and entering. I don't think that I heard any reports of any murders or rapes or anything like that, but there was definitely theft and looting and things like that. That was at the end of the second day. It's probably worse because I lived in a more dense area. Maybe the further out you go, the less of that there'll be, just because there's fewer people. But it kind of was a kick in the pants to realize how screwed I could have been and how unprepared I was. I didn't have even a half a dozen cans of soup in a cupboard. I had nothing. I would have been at the absolute mercy of my environment, of help that might come or might not come, of anybody that wanted to come and cause trouble at my house. I couldn't have done much about it. So that's what first got me thinking about it, and it took me some time after that before I actually started doing anything. I call it laziness or denial or what, but I didn't really take any steps for some time after that. And it was actually years later that I first heard the phrase prepper. Everything prepper sort of started becoming popular in pop culture all around the same time. A lot of companies and websites started popping up selling products to the prepper audience. Not long after that, the show Doomsday Preppers started airing, and I think that drew a lot of attention to the whole thing, both good and bad. My first impression of someone that would call themselves a prepper was probably pretty close to what you would consider like a government paranoid survivalist type. In my state, we've always heard stories of the Michigan militia, sometimes getting into some big trouble because of their practices. Nowadays, the Michigan militia is a different sort of group, but there's still this connotation around it. Anyway, you'd think of David Koresh and Ruby Ridge and Unabomber types when you thought of a prepper. And It's actually why I like to use the term. I like to use the term prepper and prepping. Some people don't like it because it sounds cheesy or campy, or exactly because it's got this connotation about it. But I like using it, and I think that people in our community should use it because of two reasons. One, we know exactly what we're talking about when we say prepper. There's going to be fringes on every side of it, just like anything. People that are more extreme, people that do it this way, people that do it that way. But ultimately, we all know generally the kind of concept we're talking about when we say prepping or prepper. And secondly, I like to use the term to help remove that stigma about it. When ordinary people that work ordinary jobs and have a pretty ordinary life also happen to be preppers, that's good for all of us. It removes the stigma. It expands our audience, which means more products and services that might interest us will be available. And it'll also encourage other people to get into it. When I first really started getting deep into this whole thing, I must have talked to my brother about it or something, and he must have told my mom about it. So next time I had lunch with my mom, she said, "We need to talk." And it was very serious. And she said, "I heard that you are becoming a prepper, and I'm worried. I'm concerned for you." And my eyes rolled into the back of my head, and I explained to her, I'm not descending into madness. I'm not becoming some anti-government lunatic or anything like that. I'm just thinking about how unprepared I am should something happen, such as a weather event, such as another blackout, such as anything. I don't have to tell you the kinds of reasons we prep, but I had to walk her through it. And by the end of our lunch, she said, "Oh, well, okay, well, when any of that happens, I'm coming to your house." Which I guess is the response you want to hear, because it means that they understand, not enough to start doing it themselves, but they understand enough to see why it's important. But of course, it also is that if it's my mom, I don't mind. I'm going to help my mom. But anytime you talk to anybody and make them see that it's actually sort of reasonable to get into this, you always get the, "Well, I'm coming to your house when it happens," which of course isn't the desired outcome. The desired outcome is to make them interested in helping themselves. But removing the stigma around the word prepper, I think, is a huge part of that. And the more people that are into prepping, the better, because that's more people to help one another and have the means to do so, to help the communal effort. And probably more importantly, the more people who are prepared, the fewer people I would consider threats, potential enemies, adversaries, people who don't have anything of their own, and when they become desperate, that means they want to take what someone else has. So the more preppers, the better, in my opinion. And whatever sort of brand of prepper you happen to be, you'll benefit from the word becoming more mainstream. So that's sort of my journey through how I first started thinking about prepping and preparedness, and really getting my butt in gear to start becoming more prepared. So let me know if there was some specific thing that got you into it. Was there an event? Was there a situation? Or did you just have a sudden revelation? Maybe you experienced that blackout as well. I'd be interested to hear about it. Let me know. So that's it. Until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.